All right, well, hello and welcome to what I believe is the last day of Unit 10, or at least the last day for new material in Unit 10. And this lesson is going to be part 2 of our discussion of populations. Okay, so our essential question that we are trying to answer today is this: what factors or elements in an environment limit the population growth? Okay, what things in an ecosystem or an environment are going to keep a population from just growing and growing and growing and growing? There are those things that exist, and we're going to talk about each one of them individually. Okay, now the first thing to know about is that when conditions in an area are good, a population is going to generally grow. So take this duck, for example, right? There's plenty of food, there's plenty of space, there's plenty of water, there aren't very many predators. So what's going to happen with this duck population? It's going to start to grow, right? Eventually, though, there's something in the environment that's going to halt or stop that population growth, right? It could be more predators or not enough food, right? Or not enough space. And what those things are, what they're called, are limiting factors, okay? So, limiting factors, they're an environmental factor that causes a population to stop growing or even decrease in size, okay? So there are very many limiting factors, and we're going to talk about them in this lesson. Okay, so the key limiting factors we're talking about are food, shelter, water, space, disease, parasitism, predation, and nesting sites. It may seem like a lot, but it's really not. Okay, so let's hop into our first one, which is food. Okay, remember, organisms don't just need food, right? They need enough food to survive. Okay? So, suppose a giraffe, like the ones in this picture, they need 10 kilograms of food per day. One giraffe. All right? And let's say that the trees in the area, they can give 100 kilograms of food per day and stay healthy. Okay? How many giraffes could live in this area? Could 5 giraffes live there? 5 giraffes would consume 50 kilograms of food per day. Yeah, 5 giraffes could. Could 10? Yeah, 10 could, right? They would use the max amount of food, but could 15? Could 15 giraffes live in this environment? The answer is no, okay? No matter how much shelter or water or how good the conditions are, the population can never grow much larger than 10 giraffes, right? Because food is a limiting factor in this environment, okay? And now, that's what we just talked about in this example was something known as carrying capacity. And basically, carrying capacity is the largest population that an area can support. Okay, the carrying capacity of the environment we just talked about with the giraffes was 10 giraffes. Okay, that was its carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is not always the same, and the size of a population, it can vary, right? It's not always going to stay the same, but it's usually going to stay near the area's carrying capacity. Okay, so with the giraffe example, the population's probably going to stay around 10, but it could go higher than that occasionally, and it could drop below that, but the population is going to generally stay around that number. Okay, let's move on to our next limiting factor, which is shelter. Okay, think of ways that humans use shelter, such as for protection from storms, right? We got lots of hurricanes here. Would you like to be stuck out in a hurricane? Probably not. And other organisms also rely on different forms of shelter for protection and survival. So, for example, without a place to hide or hibernate, young black bears like this one can be run out of an area or even killed by an adult black bear. Or adult black bears, if they have a hard time finding shelter, they could die or lose their young. This would affect the overall population, which is a limiting factor. right? If there's not enough shelter for all the bears, some of them are going to die, right? That's a fact of their environment, okay? So shelter is one of those factors. The next one we're going to talk about is water, right? Water is a pretty easy one because we know water is essential for life. But the quality, right, how good the water is, and the quantity, how much water there is, that can mean the difference between life and death for living things. A period of drought in the African savanna, it could mean hundreds of thousands of creatures dying, right? And if the water quality is really bad, right? What if the zebra is just drinking yucky, polluted water? What could happen to the giraffes? They could get sick. It could make them more likely to die, right? So, how good the water is and how much there is, both of those are going to affect a population, okay? So, it's important to keep in mind. The next is space. And you may think that space only affects animal populations, but the amount of space available is going to determine whether a plant can get sunlight, right? The amount of space available is going to determine if a plant can get water or soil nutrients, okay? So space can affect things like these black-eyed Susans or the yellow wildflower. And these black-eyed Susans, they're competing with other species of plants in this area for those resources we talked about. And if, say, a taller plant begins to grow over these black-eyed Susans, what do you think is going to happen? Right? They're not going to have access to those resources they need, like sunlight, and they could die. So space is a really important limiting factor for plant species as well as animals, okay? But always keep plants in mind. We know we like animals because they're more charismatic, but plants are important too. And they're the topic of our next limiting factor, which is disease. So this is a limiting factor, especially in densely populated areas. And again, if you don't remember what density is, remember density means how closely packed things are to one another. So during warm, rainy periods, some crops, like these tomatoes, they develop a disease that's called early blight. Okay? And what this disease does is it causes a plant's leaves to rot, like you can see in this picture, and fall off, which eventually kills the plants. And if there's a lot of plants really close together, right, if it's very densely populated, one organism, right, one of these tomato plants could have the disease, but it could pass it on to another tomato and another and another, and it could end up killing all of the tomatoes, right? So this limits the size of the plant population. It's an important limiting factor, especially, again, in densely populated areas. All right. The next one we're going to talk about are predation and parasitism. Okay, they're very similar in how they limit populations, so I lump them together in one. So when a large number of predators, like lions, live in an area, predation can be a limiting factor. So, which makes sense, right? The more predators there are, the more prey they're going to eat, right? So there's not going to be that many prey, and the population could even decrease because the predators are eating and eating and eating, right? Similarly, parasites like this chestnut lamprey, they have a similar effect. So what the lamprey is doing, it's feeding off of the perch, its body fluids, right? And it eventually will kill it. So this is going to benefit the lamprey, but it's going to kill the perch. So it's limiting the population of the perches. Okay? Finally, one more. The last one, limiting factor, is nesting sites. So the availability of nesting sites limits populations in much the same way that space does. Okay, so gannets, this is a gannet right here. Gannets are seabirds. And what a lot of seabirds, they live exclusively in this ocean, right? The only time they come to shore is to nest, like these gannets, okay? And this space can get very crowded, right? Look at all those gannets. And if there's a pair of gannets that can't find a nesting site, right? They can't find room, they're not going to be able to reproduce, right? They're not going to be able to add any offspring to the population. So the availability of nesting sites on the shore, it's a limiting factor for the gannets. If there's not a nest, they cannot reproduce. Okay, so there's only so many gannets that can reproduce. It depends on the nesting sites. All right, so that's the last slide of this presentation. It's pretty short and sweet. So what do we learn? We learned what factors limit population growth, right? Food limits population growth, as does shelter and water and space and predation and parasitism and nesting sites. And we also learned the term carrying capacity, right? We know carrying capacity is the largest population that an area can support. We use the giraffe example. And limiting factors, what are those? Those are environmental factors that cause a population to stop growing or decrease in size. So that's it for this lesson. Please make sure that you completed your notes and any assignments that I have given to you. If you have any questions, as always, please feel free to text me or email me, and I will see you next time.